Kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rastić je taj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rastić je taj pod zvijezdom slobode, partije i pod srcem Tita. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvom rudaru i tvome rataru, mir graditelju i tvom čuvaru, mir tvojoj sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rastić
Greetings, everybody, and good afternoon. You join us today on the 4th of October 2024, and we're coming to you today with another live stream focusing on our ongoing series, a Marxist history of World War II. And today, as previously outlined, we're going to be looking at some of the building blocks which became Nazism and fascism more broadly. So what we intend to demonstrate by going through these various different elements that made up fascist thought is that there was nothing particularly new or original in it, that there was much in it that was very common in the early part of the 20th century and the late 19th century. And it is to that which we will now turn. So this week we're going to be looking at social Darwinism, eugenics, and so-called scientific racism, and which, of course, all played their part in certainly the so-called thoughts of the failed Austrian watercolor artist and his ravings in Mein Kampf, which we will come to in a few weeks' time. But before looking at the work of Hitler himself, we need to look at the people who came before him, because all he was really doing was just expressing a new version of very common prejudices that existed within ruling class circles in Germany, France, Britain, Italy, but particularly the most successful imperialist countries. So Germany, France, Britain, and the United States. The United States in particular, as well as the British, were very into, and still are, eugenics, different forms of scientific racism, different forms of Malthusian thought, and different forms of social Darwinism, all of which we will explain in due course. But to give you an idea as to how widespread certain sentiments were, I'm going to read to you, good listeners and viewers, a quote which I would like those who are watching live to guess who said it. So this quote is from around about the same time as the period we're talking about here. So quote reads as follows: "And how will the new republic treat the inferior races? How will it deal with the black? How will it deal with the yellow man? How will it tackle the alleged termite in the civilized woodwork, the Jew? Certainly not as races at all. It will aim to establish, and it will at last, though probably only after a second century has passed, establish a world state with a common language and a common rule. All over the world its roads, standards and laws and its apparatus of control will run. It will, I have said, make the multiplication of those who fall behind a certain standard of social efficiency unpleasant and difficult. The Jew will probably lose much of his particularism, intermarry with the Gentiles, and cease to be a physically distinct element in human affairs in a century or so. But much of his moral tradition will, I hope, never die. And for the rest, those swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow people who do not come into the needs of efficiency. Well, the world is not a charitable institution, and I take it they will have to go. The whole tenor and meaning of the world, as I see it, is that they have to go, so far as they fail to develop sane, vigorous, distinctive personalities for the great world of their future. It is their portion to die out and disappear." So that is a quote from the early 20th century, and it is not the failed Austrian watercolor artist, though you could have been mistaken for thinking it was him. Now, what guesses have we got in the chat? Winston Churchill, well, could easily have been him. He said similar things. Henry Ford, not extreme enough for Henry Ford, I think, from that guess from David King there. One guess comes in from, I'm presuming, a Greek viewer who says, the Grand Magister of the KKK. Could have been. Uh, Svetlana guesses Spencer Chamberlain. Dave Alberts guesses Mel Gibson. It could easily have been. And Grassy Knoll guesses Woodrow Wilson. Good guess, not correct. Svetlana is the winner of this today's prize with her guess of H.G. Wells. Now that's from an early work of H.G. Wells in the early 20th century. It's part of his series of thoughts on, well, his own version of socialism. And bear in mind, H.G. Wells called himself a socialist for a long time. Now, to be completely fair to H.G. Wells, he did, in later years, move away from this under the influences of more radical traditions. But as a younger man, writing as a member of, well, the bourgeois intelligentsia in the early 20th century, and as a man who was considered a great progressive of his time, even in his early years, these were fairly common opinions. And these were, of course, the opinions of him, the opinions of George Bernard Shaw, the Anglo-Irish playwright, and others who founded the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the most prominent elements that lies within the Labour Party to this day. And back then, they were one of the crucial elements that were the founders of the Labour Party. And so the views that Wells expresses there, which are an ugly combination of social Darwinism, Malthusianism, and so-called scientific racism, those were all very common beliefs within the bourgeois intelligentsia at the time. Eugenics was something that was, whilst it was a sort of co-creation of European, British, and American so-called scientists, it was in Britain that it got a lot of its intellectual work done in the early years, and Wells was familiar with that and agreed with it. Now, I want you to note what Wells keeps talking about in this quote, because there's a lot in it. He keeps talking about efficiency. And efficiency meaning, of course, in Wells's view and Wells's version of socialism, the efficiency demanded by capitalism, by modern industry. And in the view of Wells and those like him, specifically those of his class, those who weren't adapted to modern industry must perish. And that's why he's referring so disparagingly to what he would refer to and what people of his class referred to as the lesser races. But I read that out to you, not just to condemn Wells, because, of course, Wells did evolve slightly beyond those views, though his views always remain those of an English bourgeois lover of technocracy, which is really what he was. But again, I read his quote to you because, again, these are common views. When we're looking at the foundations of fascism, we can find them all over the bourgeois intelligentsia of the defiantly anti-rationalist right wing, and the bourgeois intelligentsia of the so-called rational left wing. These were very common views within the bourgeoisie, as was, by the way, an extreme form of anti-worker prejudice that would be expressed through social Darwinism, as we'll come to in just a moment. And also the other running influence in there, and an influence that will be found amongst those who you could refer to as the bourgeois socialists that Marx once critiqued, would be the influence of Malthus, Thomas Malthus, the English clergyman turned so-called political economist, social commentator, the man who gave his name to the doctrine of Malthusianism, who was openly horrified by the growth of the big cities of industrial England in the early 19th century, and became convinced that the proletariat would literally eat the bourgeoisie out of house and home. And this is what was laid behind a lot of his paranoid ravings about overpopulation. Now, these are still very popular theories within the ruling class to this day. You don't need to go too far to see various different interpretations of Malthusian thought in, again, left-wing thought to this day, as well as the more openly reactionary theorists. Left-wing green types were enamored with Malthusian theories in the 1970s and continue to be so to this day. The idea that there are too many people and too few resources is a point of view that's very popular amongst the capitalist class, but it's also very popular amongst various left-wingers and has been for over a century. And Wells was reflecting some of that as well. So this is again, like Malthusianism, very common. It runs into the ground in terms of the bourgeois' ability to implement it, because what the bourgeois could never get away from, even though they wanted to, was, of course, they couldn't get away from the fact that they needed the proletariat. Without the proletariat, there's no profit. When there's no profit, there's no more capital. No more capital, no more capitalists. And so what you see in the history of bourgeois thought is this constant push and pull between the desire of the more sort of rabid Malthusian intellectuals to depopulate the planet and go back to, only having 500 million people on it or something very small like that, and the constant need of capital for ever greater amounts of labor, despite improvements in automation over the years, and therefore the constant need to boost the population, even now to this day. So the bourgeois thought you see floating around is always schizophrenic. It's always caught between their hatred and their disgust at the proletariat, and also at the same time their constant need for more proletarians. And they haven't reached the point yet where they can work out how to give a robot a debit card and have him become the ideal consumer, because of course that's sheer dumb dystopianism and won't happen. But that's why bourgeois thought is so schizophrenic. On the one hand, the bourgeoisie is horrified and terrified of the fact that they have created in the form of the proletariat their own gravediggers. On the other hand, they can't do without the proletariat, so they're stuck constantly bouncing between these different schools of thought. So that's Wells and the rather popular prejudices of Malthusianism, social Darwinism, and scientific racism. And it is to social Darwinism that we will now turn. And social Darwinism is a good place to start when considering all of these the building blocks of fascism, because Darwin's breakthrough in the origin of the species and his wider research is this huge step forward for human understanding. And Marx and Engels, as men of science, welcomed this in terms of its clarifying of the true path of evolution taken by all species. And Engels, in a later letter to a comrade of his in Russia called Lavrov, talked about the breakthrough in Darwin's theory and welcomed it and said that this was a huge step forward in scientific understanding. Marx wrote to Darwin expressing his admiration for the origin of the species. And what Darwin's breakthrough boils down to, and again I'm going to shortcut this a great deal, but the scientific breakthrough was that the species that thrived the most were and are those who have the greatest amount of adaptability to their environment. Now, that breakthrough, of course, didn't come as a bolt from the blue. There were other anthropologists and scientists who'd been looking at evolution before Darwin. He was just one who came along and codified it into two books, really. And so the doctrine has his name. But it's a good example of how capitalism automatically and immediately starts distorting even a great scientific breakthrough such as that. Because what immediately happens is the ideologists of capital have to try and now adapt this to their own needs. Because if it's the case that human beings aren't chosen, which is one of the big explanations of the bourgeoisie as to how the order of things is dictated. It comes from the Almighty himself. If human beings weren't, taken and placed in the Garden of Eden and then were expelled from the garden and have been struggling to fulfill God's diktats ever since then. But if they weren't created by God, if they struggled out of the primordial stew, shall we say, if the triumph of human beings is because of our adaptability and our ability to work together as a species, then that takes the shine off the rulers slightly, because if there's no God involved, then you're not chosen by him, which is of course the previous explanation for the rule of monarchs. And if human beings aren't special, then but we are just merely an example of a particularly creative species amongst many, or if there is no divine presence involved, then that makes human society look a whole lot less rigid and a whole lot more malleable, meaning that human society can take many different forms, meaning that it could take in the future a form that was not ruled over by a small coterie, a small class of property owners. It makes human society look a lot more adaptable, and you can draw very radical conclusions from that. So almost immediately, various people, including T.H. Huxley, Aldous Huxley's grandfather, and others, started to get to work on adapting this to suit the purposes of mid to late 19th century British capitalism. And in doing so, they drew upon partially the work of Malthus and others to come up with a doctrine that would scientifically justify the place of the ruling class at the top of British capitalism in perpetuity, and also the place of the British ruling class over and above all the subjugated peoples of the British Empire. This was also, of course, a project which they shared in common with all of the other European colonial powers and, of course, the US imperialists as they emerged. Because the idea of a scientific explanation for the imperial system is one that would, of course, appeal to the ruling class. Now, here we will turn back to another disgusting creature, aside from the views of a man who played a big part in building up the views of the bourgeois in the 19th century. That is, of course, the case of Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is these days deservedly forgotten amongst everybody except for the Ludwig von Mises crowd, because he's one of the originators of what you would identify now as libertarianism. In fact, in the book History Demanding the Impossible: A History of Anarchism, the writer of that book, Peter Marshall, who is an interesting figure in his own right. He also writes about witchcraft, sorcery, and alchemy. She's, funnily enough, makes him entirely the right man to write about anarchism. But in Marshall's History of Anarchism, he credits Spencer with being one of the intellectual founders of the modern anarchist tradition, which is quite funny, really, when you consider that Spencer was an extreme anti-working class ideologue, a man who wanted to justify the wealth and power of the bourgeoisie, without reference to God, but with reference to Darwin. Now, Spencer wrote a number of books, which these days, when I was looking for copies of these, I found them all on US libertarian websites. And you can, when you look at Spencer's work, you can really see the libertarian to fascist pipeline quite clearly. So Spencer, who again was actually from the same English county that I'm from, Derbyshire. He was born in Derby, shamefully enough. But he wrote in his book Social Statics in 1851 the following, and I'll quote it to you in full. To become fit for the social state, man has not only to lose his savageness, but he has to acquire the capacities needful for civilized life. Power of application must be developed, such modification of the intellect as shall qualify it for its new tasks must take place. And above all, there must be gained the ability to sacrifice a small immediate gratification for a future great one. The state of transition will of course be an unhappy state. Misery inevitably results from incongruity between constitution and conditions. All these evils which afflict us, and seem to the uninitiated the obvious consequences of this or that removable cause, are unavoidable attendants of the adaptation now in progress. Humanity is being pressed against the inexorable necessities of its new position, is being moulded into harmony by them, and has to bear the resulting unhappiness as best it can. The process must be undergone, and the sufferings must be endured. No power on earth, no cunningly devised laws of statesmen, no world-rectifying schemes of the humane, no communist panaceas, no reforms that men ever did broach or will ever breach, can diminish them one lot. Intensified they may be, and are, and in preventing their intensification, the philanthropic will find ample scope for exertion. But there is bound up with the change a normal amount of suffering, which cannot be lessened without altering the very laws of life. So that's Spencer from the book Social Statics. Now Spencer, what he's saying there basically is that, and that's in 1851 he wrote that. So that's before or just after some of the first Reform Act, just after the abolition of the Corn Laws. What men like Spencer were justifying at the time was things like child labour. And what Spencer is doing there is saying, yes, I know we have to continue to send children under cotton machines. We have to send children under the mill machinery of mid-19th century Britain. We have to still send children down mines in order that we can have a bright and clear future. And that there has to be suffering now, and there can be no attempt to lessen it, because later on we will be greeted with a wondrous society. Now, he goes into greater detail about his view on this, and specifically his view of the proletariat later in his work, The Man versus the State. But I want you to note there that he's already denouncing communism in 1851, basically saying that the suffering of the working class is such that there is no way around it. It has to be that way. And any attempt to change it will only make things worse. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because essentially it's the same argument that many, libertarians certainly, but many defenders of capitalism use to this day. Now, Spencer goes much further than this in The Man versus the State, which was published later. So in The Man versus the State, which was written 30 years after Social Statics, so in the 1880s, after the publication of Darwin's work, here we get to another quote from Spencer, who says as following: "The lapse of a third of a century since the above passages were published has brought me no reason for retreating from the position taken up in them. Contrariwise, it has brought a vast amount of evidence strengthening that position. The beneficial results of the survival of the fittest prove to be immeasurably greater than those above indicated. The process of natural selection, as Mr. Darwin called it, cooperating with a tendency to variation and to inheritance of variations, he has shown to be a chief cause, though not, I believe, the sole cause, of that evolution through which all living beings, beginning with the lowest and diverging and rediverging as they evolved, have reached their present degrees of organization and adaptation to their modes of life. So familiar has this truth become that some apology seems needed for naming it. And yet, strange to say, now that this truth is recognized by most cultivated people, now that the beneficent working of the survival of the fittest has been so impressed on them, that much more than people in past times, they might be expected to hesitate before neutralizing its action. Now more than ever before in the history of the world, they are doing all they can to further survival of the unfittest." So let's go over what we are taking in there from Spencer. Spencer kept arguing that following Malthus really, that any attempt at alleviating the suffering of the working class domestically, and it was the working class domestically that Spencer was really invested in making sure was exploited to the fullest amount possible. The He's arguing there that the state of capitalism, that the state of the working class, the immiserated state of the working class, is not only natural, but it's good. It's good that things are this way, because what we're actually doing is we're breeding via the imposition of suffering a much more durable race that will come out of this. The unfit will be killed in the process, and this will secure a stronger future for everybody. Now, I want you to bear in mind that Herbert Spencer was some soft-handed wanker who came from the middle of England, who never did a day's hard work in his life and spent most of his time idly speculating in various universities, much like most libertarians today, to be honest. But again, very, very common belief, which Engels is to mock in a later quote from a letter that we'll be reading from. But I want you to bear in mind that, of course, that people like Spencer had no real understanding of where profit was derived from, how labour actually worked, or anything like that. What Spencer saw as strength was, of course, those who were at the top already. And those who were at the top already, i.e. the property owners, well, they must be there via a natural order. And you can no longer claim that God put them there, or I suppose you could, but Spencer liked to proclaim his rationality. And therefore, he embraced a bastardized version of Darwin's theory. And he coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest is part of what comes to obsess the failed Austrian watercolour artist later on. Now, this idea of the survival of the fittest, this is our sort of segue between social Darwinism and eugenics. Because in social Darwinism, which is what Spencer is credited, even by very bourgeois writers now, Spencer is credited with creating this, because what he the adaptation of Darwin's theory that he maybe pioneered was that the capitalist class were obviously the fittest because they had adapted themselves most thoroughly to the environment, and therefore they completely deserved to be where they were. And those who were perishing by the age of 21 sometimes or earlier in like the dye works of the English East Midlands, the girls dying in their late teens in the lace making sweatshops of London or Nottingham, those who died in industrial accidents in the coal mines, those who choked on poisonous fumes in various different industrial concerns across England. Marx, by the way, outlines all of these conditions in Capital Volume 1, all of these horrors in Capital Volume 1, that all of that is good because, those people are meant to perish. What emerges will be stronger. And if we fast forward to the views of the Austrian watercolor artist and how these came to be state policy under the Nazis, you can see that not only does this completely, of course, fit with the needs of capital to justify the most brutal and horrific conditions of exploitation, but also how it goes over into the most extreme forms of eugenics. The idea being that the weak have to be culled and killed off in order that the stronger representatives of the race can survive. Well, that's something which obviously comes to full and horrific conclusions with its imposition by the Nazis later. But as with everything else that the Nazis do, it is merely the most full and complete expression of the horrific pro-capitalist theories of people like Spencer, who came much earlier, and others, and even those such as Wells, who declared themselves to be socialists. And this is why, I think, for many who of the Wells school of socialism, They later slipped. Part of the reason why they later slipped easily into supporting going from reformist socialism to fascism is because there's not that much of a jump between the two. If your view of socialism is one of a, as Wells's was, to be honest, it was never of working class rule. It was always of rule by technocrats over an industrialized society. That was their view of, that was the Fabian view of socialism. And of course, some of those people could easily find a home within Mussolini's fascist party or even the Hitlerites. So the social Darwinist element is fairly easy to explain. The eugenics element is, well, just as horrifying, but is an extension of that in many different ways. Eugenics also is popularized by some comes after Darwinism, and has a certain antecedents within it. Now, eugenics is incredibly popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It got kind of disgraced by its association with the Nazis, but it's never really gone away, because again, it's a form of bourgeois thought. And eugenics, in brief, can be summarized as being about inherited characteristics. And according to the eugenicists, and again, there's many different varieties of eugenicists, but I think it's fair to summarize that they shared this particular belief in common, which is that the inherited characteristics can include almost anything. So inherited characteristics can include, if a father is strong, physically strong, therefore his sons will be physically strong. But it goes beyond that, because that might sound uncontroversial, but we know that now, thanks to, amongst others, the work of people like T.D. Lysenko and other real scientists, and like the quacks who are in favor of eugenics, we know that in what inherited characteristics are a lot more complex than simply father is strong, therefore son will be strong. Now, what the eugenicists also came to believe, or what some of them came to believe, was that not only is it the case that physical characteristics or mental characteristics are inherited directly from parent to child, but also that other things are, such as a predilection for poverty. And again, this was fairly widely accepted amongst so-called social scientists in the early 20th century, and has made a comeback in recent years as well. In fact, it never, amongst the social sciences, this belief never really went away. If you look at people like Charles Murray, who's beloved by like reactionary thinkers these days, who was a social theorist and wrote a lot on US welfare issues in barely veiled racist terms. Like this idea of poverty being genetic, it's again, it's never really gone away. And it starts in the early 19th century. And it's a very convenient theory for the capitalist class, because if poverty is passed on in the genes, then, well, wealth must be as well. Leadership must be. So what they've done, the eugenicists in the early 20th century, is that they have come up with a pseudo-scientific theory that justifies hierarchy and rule by a tiny minority of property owners. Because if we can't claim that God put us at the top anymore, we'll claim that our genes put us at the top. We are not just wealthy because our great grandfather stole a load of land and then expelled or killed all the peasants that lived on it, or founded a mine where he sent 9-year-olds down there to mine gold for him in South Africa or something. No, it's that we've inherited good genes. And along with those good genes come with an enormous property portfolio. And this is literally what many of them thought, and what whole books were devoted to proving in inverted commas. And this is why, like in the early 20th century, the leap from at the actual science of Darwinism, which of Darwin's theories of natural selection, to Spencer's pseudo scientific babble of survival of the fittest, to the eugenicists' idea that poverty is inheritable in the very genetic makeup of the person, and also, by the way, wealth and property ownership and leadership, as they would put it, is also inheritable via the genetic makeup of a person. It's not that far away from going from that to going towards purely mystical beliefs of like eternal leadership classes, or descendants of the elven blood, or other such sort of mystical psychobabble, or like eternal souls passing from one person to another. Like eugenics leads you to a place where you're not that far away from believing in that, which is why a lot of these people who were into like race science and heavily into eugenics and social Darwinism were also predisposed towards some totally insane beliefs about the supernatural and things like that. Because you're really not that far away from it if you're believing that you are literally, your wealth is literally justified by your genes. It's an insane belief. And you find the similar types of people who, like, down to this day, who are obsessed with things like IQ tests and shit like that, who are obsessed with the idea that everything's inheritable. And what that leads you towards is like a belief that there is a sort of inherited leadership class. And again, no surprise that the Austrian watercolor artist picks up on that, or that he also picks up on the theories of scientific racism as expressed in terms of the idea that there is a hierarchy of the races, and this idea had been floating around in European intellectual circles since the 17th century. In fact, since the modern colonialism began after the discovery of the Americas by Columbus, and almost immediately racialist theories started to emerge in European intellectual circles to justify it. And these are very interesting in terms of their early composition, because the earliest forms of them were obsessed with the idea that the Europeans, or the Western Europeans, the ancient Egyptians, and those who came from ancient India were all linked together through some sort of one Aryan bloodline. That was one such theory that was floating around for quite a long time. So there's always been this strange obsession, which I should probably do more reading on, with Aryan being this sort of trifecta between certain parts of Southeast Asia, certain parts of Western Europe, and certain parts of West Asia, that have all been part of this sort of Aryan nation, to use a phrase. So the idea that idea, of course, again, like was recycled many times over, and it gets to ridiculous levels in the 19th century, in that like you get like various racial theorists claiming that that there is like one specific bit of the Nordic countries is more superior than another specific bit of the Nordic countries. And then you get like racial theorists proclaiming loudly that the Irish are a whole separate race who are actually descended from black Africans who were washed ashore in Ireland, and therefore it's justified that the English take over and enslave them. There's literally like drawings, you can just find them on the internet now, from like the middle 19th century, which have drawn a typical Englishman who looks like some sort of effete poet lying in an opium den, and an Irishman who looks like an ape, basically. So there was all of these like bizarre theories in English bourgeois circles, again justifying the crushing and oppression of subjugated peoples. That was what it was really all about. And again, these theories come about when Europeans start marching into other countries and subjugating them. Well, you're going to need an intellectual industry to justify that. And so all these intellectual prostitutes dutifully oblige with the so-called racial science. And this again was not just something that was discussed openly. This was something that almost all of the bourgeois intelligentsia and political circles believed in, really publicly, until World War II, and now they believe in it privately. Because after World War II, for a long time, you couldn't come out openly and proclaim your belief in this because, well, it's associated with the Austrian watercolor artist, and you can't really say that openly. They believe in it privately, though. They do. Again, like, if we examine the justifications amongst, not just amongst like the most frothing reactionaries like Boris Johnson or people like that, but amongst left-wingers, if we examine the justifications they put forward for the war upon Russia, racial theory comes right back all the time. They dress it up as like civilizational theory. They dress it up these days as like, oh, the democratic nations. We're the democratic nations. The Russians are just predisposed towards tyranny. I don't know what it is. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, etc. Or a defense. Ukraine is the shield of the West. Of course, they fail to mention that the shield absorbs the blows meant for the wielder of the shield. Or Israel. Let's look at that. Like occupied Palestine, the Zionist movement, originally, of course, made up of those who were leaving Europe to seek out their own colonial project elsewhere. But again, often portrayed often by people who have no liking for the Jewish faith, but often portrayed again as a sword arm of the West in West Asia. The little loyal Jewish Ulster, etc. And how Israel is, well, it's just more like us. They're just more like us, aren't they? Now, what does that mean? Again, dive into any editorial defending Israel in the Telegraph, for instance. Now, when it comes to Israel, the traditional sort of bourgeois left in Britain gets a little bit more squeamish, but they certainly go all in with their defense of Western civilization in Ukraine, and you don't need to go too far into their writings to find that they're launching into defenses of civilizational values and how Russia is, well, it's just a different place. These people love tyranny, etc., etc. They'll never understand the wonders of free and democratic Europe, etc. All bollocks, of course, but what it goes to show is that eugenicist thought, civilizational theories built on so-called pseudoscientific racism, all of this is still around, as is Malthusianism, as is the obsessions that drove Herbert Spencer. These aren't things that Hitler, just sitting in his jail cell, dreamed up. This is the sordid tapestry of early to mid 20th century bourgeois thought. He's just expressing it in the terms tinged with heavy German romanticism. But all of this, which ultimately leads to wars of annihilation, enslavement, and the attempted extermination of those who were deemed to be racially inferior, or in the case of the annihilation of the disabled or the mentally retarded, those who could pass on unwanted characteristics. Of course, we know now that is absolutely quack bullshit about the scientific so-called theories that was based on. All bullshit. But again, this was the logic of all of these bourgeois trends, which was pushed to the absolute limits under fascism, because that's what fascism is. It's the most extreme form of bourgeois rule, and therefore you find expressed within it the most extreme forms of expression of bourgeois thought, which all ends in enslavement and annihilation. That's where it ends. Okay, so we'll go now to some interesting quotes from Engels. And now Engels, in his work Anti-Düring and his work on the origin of the family, private property, and the state, I would encourage everybody to read both of these. And on the origin of the family is fascinating because it Engels picks up on many themes that are first found in Darwin and gives them a proper materialist basis. Now, here in his letter to Lavrov from 1875, he takes the Darwinians to task, and it's worth reading a couple of excerpts from this. So, Engels states the following: of the Darwinian theory, I accept the theory of evolution, but only take Darwin's method of proof, struggle for life, natural selection, as the first provisional and incomplete expression of a newly discovered fact. Before Darwin, the very people who now see nothing but the struggle for existence everywhere were stressing precisely the cooperation in organic nature, how the vegetable kingdom supplies the animal kingdom with oxygen and foodstuffs, while the animal kingdom in turn supplies the vegetable kingdom with carbonic acid and manures, as Liebig in particular has emphasized. Both conceptions have a certain justification within certain limits, but each is as one-sided and narrow as the other. The interaction of natural bodies, whether animate or inanimate, includes alike harmony and collision, struggle and cooperation. If, therefore, a so-called natural scientist permits himself to subsume the whole manifold wealth of historical development under the one-sided and meagre phrase struggle for existence, a phrase which even in the sphere of nature can only be taken with a grain of salt, such a proceeding is its own condemnation. The whole Darwinian theory of the struggle for existence is simply the transference from society to animate nature of Hobbes' theory of the war of every man against every man, and the bourgeois economic theory of competition, along with the Malthusian theory of population. This feat having been accomplished, as indicated, I dispute its unqualified justification, especially where the Malthusian theory is concerned. The same theories are next transferred back again from organic nature to history, and their validity as eternal laws of human society declared to have been proved. The childishness of this procedure is obvious. It is not worth wasting words over. But if I wanted to go into it further, I should do it in such a way that I exposed them in the first place as bad economists, and only in the second place as bad natural scientists and philosophers. The essential difference between human and animal activity is that animals are at most gatherers, whilst men are producers. The single but cardinal distinction alone makes it impossible to transfer the laws of animal societies to human societies. It makes possible, as you justly remark, man waged a struggle not only for existence but for enjoyment, and for the increase of his enjoyments. He was ready to renounce the lower enjoyments for the sake of the higher. At a certain stage, therefore, human production reaches a level where not only essential necessities, but also luxuries are produced, even if for the time being they are only produced for a minority. Hence the struggle for existence, if we allow the category no longer for the mere means of existence, but for the means of development, socially produced means of development, and at this stage, the category production in its capitalist form produces a greater abundance of the means of existence and development than capitalist society can consume, because capitalist society keeps the great mass of the real producers artificially removed from the means of existence and development. If this society is forced by the law of its own existence continually to increase production already too great for it, and therefore periodically every 10 years reaches a point where it destroys a mass not only of products but of productive forces, what sense is there still left in talking about a struggle for existence? The struggle for existence can only consist in the producing class taking away the control of production and distribution from the class hitherto entrusted with it, but now no longer capable of it. That, however, is the socialist revolution. So, to look at the long quote I've just given you from Engels there, he says several interesting things to counteract Spencer and T.H. Huxley and H.G. Wells himself. So, making the first point, which is that the The Darwinian theory, as it became expressed, was just basically turned into from a discovery about the adaptability of different animals and how those who were the most adaptable became, in Darwin's view, the most successful. First of all, Engels says it's a reproduction of like Hobbes's theory of each against all, and also bourgeois economic theory, which is true. That's how people like Spencer quite literally took it in that direction, quite explicitly. But also that these people are bad scientists and bad economists, as Engels says, because they don't draw a distinction between human beings and animals. And it reveals, of course, that they view the worker as being nothing more than an animal. Because as Engels says there, the human being is not just simply a gatherer anymore. The human being is a creator. The human being can create through combining together in cooperative labor, vast means of production, which means that there is no more scarcity. So, but even by like the early 20th century, in fact, the later 19th century, the means of production existed to make sure that there was no more scarcity in the world. The reason why there was scarcity was not because of underdevelopment, it was because of private ownership of the means of production, meaning that, as Engels says there in that quote, that every 10 years you have a vast crisis of overproduction, and which can only be resolved by destroying commodities and destroying means of production. So therefore, to again go back to what Engels was saying, the capitalist class is no longer fit to possess the means of production, because it cannot go a decade without a major crisis which necessitates destruction of means of production, destruction of commodities, and destruction of labor itself in the form of human beings. Now, the human being has reached a point where there's no longer any need for scarcity. We've evolved as intelligent and thinking and tool producing and wielding creatures who can create a huge variety of, or can create our way out of a huge variety of problems. So the talk of scarcity, which underpins the work of Malthus, need no longer apply. The talk of the hierarchy being justified by those at the top being there by dint of the fact that they are the strongest or the most adaptable, that is nonsense, considering that those at the top are merely the greatest exploiters. They are in fact the least capable. They're given that it is the worker that produces everything, and those at the top sit there, clip the coupon, and produce nothing. And also, the only struggle worth really talking about, as Engels rightly points out in this letter, is the struggle to take the means of production away from the bourgeois. So if you remove the means of production from the bourgeois, all artificial scarcity can be eliminated. But then again, let's get back to why fascism adopts all of these elements of thought which are predicated upon scarcity and predicated upon lack of progress. It's because, again, it's a most extreme expression of bourgeois rule. And bourgeois rule needs to resolve the gigantic crises of overproduction through massive amounts of destruction, including of living labor, of human beings. And that is why, of course, all of these theories still appeal to the bourgeoisie, because they speak directly to their class interests. But I think that the quote from Engels there is very useful to keep in our minds, because though there are still those to this day who try to claim that human beings are by nature non-cooperative, that we are non-rational, that we are unthinking, that we can't exist in a cooperative society because we're too individualistic, that there is a certain amount of natural scarcity around, all of which can be easily counteracted by simply examining the world that capitalism itself has built. So, to draw our remarks today to a conclusion, it is no surprise that such theories such as eugenics and social Darwinism and scientific racism are very popular with the bourgeoisie. It speaks to their class interests. It speaks to their wish to justify the hierarchy that they are at the top of. And that is why, of course, we will continue to, in our explanation, to look at the philosophical roots away from the pseudoscientific roots of fascism next week when we look at anti-rationalism, when we look at the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, Vilfredo Pareto, and others, who of course also played their role in influencing the Austrian watercolor artist in his frenzied scribblings in the early 1920s. So we will now pause for a few comments, though I see there's quite a lot of you commenting today. We got comments from Svetlana, who asks, I watched an interview today with a woman called Jyoti Brar on a communist Russian YouTube channel. Is she a member of the same party as me? Yes, Jyoti is a comrade of mine. She's the deputy chair of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. So yes, glad to see that her work is getting into Russian circles now. Right. Greetings to Yepex, who joins us with an important message, which I'll just highlight here on the screen. Good morning from Minnesota. Please send condolences to those affected by Hurricane Helene, and we sent them $750 while sending billions overseas for war. Yes, the complete abandonment of the American proletariat by its so-called government is interesting to note. And I know that the American Communist Party comrades are doing funding drives to help out there at the moment. It shouldn't be a surprise that the American government's just given up even the pretense of helping, but it is a surprise that they've been so open about their contempt for these people who have been hit by this hurricane. They usually at least pretend to give a shit. Okay. Right, so glad you all enjoyed the H.G. Wells quote. It's funny how so-called progressives are so caught up with pseudo-scientific racism, etc. Right. T.G. Wilson says, the violent chaos produced by social production under capitalism was created by ever more sophisticated forms of entrenched hierarchy, domination, and control. Engels also points out that the capitalist mode of social production is deeply collectivist in the worst way possible. Yeah, like we've said before, that you get collectivization of agriculture under capitalism. It's just collectivization in the capitalist sense, which was done in infinitely more destructive and brutal ways than anything that was done under the collectivization drive in the USSR. Right. Okay, so I have to draw things to a close for today. I could only take a couple of comments from the floor, unfortunately. I'll be back again tomorrow with the Ukraine war update, time to be announced. So please join me again for that. Until then, I'll say thank you to everybody for watching. Thank you to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. Stand by for next week, where the Class Consciousness Project live streams will return. So keep an eye open for that. But until I return to you tomorrow, I will say thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Hope you've gained an appreciation for the horrors of bourgeois theories. And we'll be back again with you tomorrow. Until then, good afternoon to you and solidarity.